Good afternoon. Welcome to the Safe Connections webinar today, Thursday, September 18, 2025. I want to thank everyone for joining the Student Association of Fire Ecology Safe Connections webinar series 2025. My name is Mayowa George. I'm a PhD student at Kansas State University, Manhattan, Kansas, where my work focuses on wildfire prevention, fire danger assessment, fire advocacy, and prescribed burning management. I also serve as the National Safe Leadership Team as the Secretary and Treasurer, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Please, if we are just joining this, can we just probably mute our recordings and probably mute our videos? Thank you very much. You're welcome. Um, this is the September edition of Safe Connections webinar series. The intent of the webinar is to create a forum for students and early career fire ecologists to hear from and engage with a diverse group of established professionals. Before I introduce today's speaker, I will go over some few things. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the SAFE website. All registered participants will be emailed a link to the recording once it's available, which usually takes like a week. Following the presentation, there will be time for question and answer. Please feel free to ask questions, and probably if you don't want to ask, you can type your questions in the chat. I'll be moderating the questions. Now, let me introduce our guest speaker for today. Our guest speaker for today is Dr. Gavin Jones. Dr. Gavin Jones is a research ecologist with Rocky Mountain Research Station, USDA Forest Service, and he also holds an appointment as an adjunct assistant professor in the biology department of the University of New Mexico. He completed his BSc in zoology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2011. His MSc in forest and wildfire ecology in the University of Wisconsin-Madison in May 2016, and his PhD in forest and wildfire ecology, and also has a minor in statistics in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He conducted a postdoctoral research in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida. Dr. Jones serves as an associate editor at Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment and Fire Ecology, which are the flagship peer-reviewed journals of the Ecology Society of America and the Association of Fire Ecology, respectively. Dr. Jones is a Calvi Fellow with the National Academy of Sciences and has been recognized with Early Career Achievement Award from the American Ornithological Society and the USDA Early Career Scientist Award. Dr. Jones has peer-reviewed over 30 academic publications. He has served as committee in various schools, and as someone excited about the intersection of fire ecology and wildlife conservation, once again, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jones to today's Connections. With that, I would now hand over the floor to Dr. Jones to begin his presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, Mayoa, thank you so much for that introduction. And I believe I just sent the request to share my screen. Can I get someone to holler in the chat or holler over the microphone that they can see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
All right, thanks, Annie. Okay, so yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm excited to get the chance to connect with all of you who are joining this presentation. The hope here is just to give you some insights into the type of work that you can do in the fire space, in the fire and wildlife space. So if we were all together, I'd ask for like a raise of hands of who here is interested in wildlife, who has done wildlife work or not, because this is an area of fire ecology that's really rapidly advancing and developing right now. Um, Wildlife ecology, sort of that intersection of wildlife ecology and fire ecology. And and I didn't start out as a fire ecologist, but really more as a wildlife ecologist. I'm going to talk a little bit before I get into science stuff. I'm going to just talk about how I got here um, in my professional journey, recognizing that it's just, it's going to look different from other people's journeys. It's my own, and it kind of starts here in a place that looks nothing like the Western U.S., which is where I do a lot of my research. I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and that is quite a long ways from southern Iowa, which is where I grew up, in the cornfields of southern Iowa. And I really had no understanding of fire science or fire ecology at all until really I was into grad school. Um, but kind of grew up in the flatlands of the Midwest, um, and sort of started my pursuit into science as an undergrad when I was at the University of Wisconsin. Um, this, of course, is not a picture of the University of Wisconsin. This is a picture of Glacier National Park in Montana, which was my first ever experience as an undergrad. When I was a freshman, I had a teaching assistant who was doing his dissertation on uh, this little critter right here called the American pika. And this is the student, Lucas Moyer Horner. He was a PhD student at the time working in Warren Porter's lab at Wisconsin. And what Lucas was studying was the distribution of pikas in Glacier National Park and sort of their metabolic ecology. So the thermal limits of the species, and how their metabolic rate was affected by global warming and things of that nature. And so I got into sort of my wildlife journey with a species that's not a bird. I've spent most of my career on birds, um, but really got hooked on thinking about how animals respond to their environment, whether that's sort of slow change associated with climate change or punctuated change with disturbances. This is kind of how I got into this field. So I worked with Lucas for a couple of summers in my undergrad in this incredible place. And then I went and did my graduate work at also the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in a different department, working with Zach Peary and Rocky Gutierrez on this beautiful animal here, which is the spotted owl. And when I started my work on spotted owls, I also was not thinking at all about fire or fire ecology. But what happened is I eventually had a wildfire burn through my study area, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And I became a fire ecologist sort of by accident because we then wanted to understand how the movement of spotted owls and their populations were affected by wildfire. And so that was sort of how I got into fire ecology to begin with. Got to do some really cool field work, capturing and handling these beautiful animals, tracking their movements, and studying their survival and things like that. So that was my kind of my graduate experience, and that was both my master's and my PhD in this lab, working on spotted owls, and for my PhD was really focused on fire ecology of spotted owls. After I finished grad school, I wanted to kind of get into a different system, and so I went down to University of Florida. I worked with Rob Fletcher, And what we worked on is a different system that's very fire prone, which is the longleaf pine and other southeastern forest ecosystems that are quite fire dependent. And what we were interested in is looking at patterns of biodiversity of different taxa of bats, bees, birds, and herps across this sort of experimental gradient in the southeastern US, looking at wood production and intensity in these sort of fire dependent systems. Um, and it was around this time when my wife and I started our family, had a couple kids. They got to join in some field work. It was just really great time down there at University of Florida. And for the last 5 years, I've been here at the U.S. Forest Service in Albuquerque, New Mexico, working as a research ecologist in the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And so that's part of the research and development branch of the U.S. Forest Service. And so the Forest Service has a couple of major branches, the biggest of which is the National Forest System, and that's kind of the management side of the agency. And then a smaller part is the research and development branch. And so we work really closely with the National Forest System to try and do science that helps improve land management outcomes. And so over the past 5 years, we've done a lot of really neat work using different technologies and tools like acoustic monitoring, which I'm going to talk about, GPS tracking, traditional field observations, camera trapping, and things like that to study animals. Um, a lot of sort of cooperation and collaboration with managers to do science and understand the impacts of management interventions. And then I've just had a really wonderful time building and developing a lab that here at the Forest Service, but also kind of jointly housed at the University of New Mexico, which is just down the street from where my office is. So that's kind of where my highly abbreviated journey to where how I got to where I am. And I'm really happy to chat more about this afterwards if we have some time. But for the rest of the time today, I want to talk about science. And I'm going to just give you sort of this high level overview of what the kind of work is that I do in my program, the kinds of things we learn, the kinds of questions we can ask, and hopefully just get you excited about the range of opportunities for research and study in this fire wildlife nexus. And so the main focus of my work is conservation in the Pyrocene, or how do we conserve wildlife in particular and biodiversity in general in this era of rapid changes to fire, not only our relationship with fire, but the way that fires are burning. And so there are three kind of major planks of the work that I do. The first is just understanding the ecology of wildlife in these fire-prone ecosystems and how we can conserve individual species of concern, like the spotted owl. The next piece is sort of thinking at one level higher, like how do we, or how do wildlife communities, how are they structured? How do they assemble? And how diverse are they in burned landscapes and in fire-prone ecosystems? So how does fire structure ecological communities? And then the third piece is looking at maybe an even bigger scale, which is sort of monitoring or tracking of landscape change and understanding at broad spatial scales how our landscapes are changing and how those changes are affecting species and their habitats. And so I'm going to start out talking about sort of the most fundamental level, the species level, wildlife ecology and conservation. And I'm going to start by talking about how I accidentally became a fire ecologist, which is back when I was in grad school studying this animal, the spotted owl. We were doing, I was actually working on my master's degree, and we were looking at how climate change was impacting owls and how we might be able to manage forests in a way to buffer the effects of climate change on spotted owls. Really agnostic to fire and disturbance altogether. Um, and right as we were about to publish that work or submit it to a journal for publication, we had quite a large wildfire burn right through the study area that we had been focusing on for my master's. And so this is the El Dorado demographic study area in the central Sierra Nevada in California. And each of these dots is a different study site where we'd been tracking the spotted owl for about 30 years, for longer than I had been alive at the time. And then this kind of dashed line is just part of the core study area that had been surveyed for longer and more intensively. But the point is, we have been doing this work in the study area, and then this fire came through and kind of ruined it. The work that we were doing, it didn't seem to matter as much, and we were all pretty devastated. But then we realized that this was really a natural experiment. And in ecology, we rarely get to do these kinds of experiments at sufficiently large scales to understand how interventions like fire or management might um, impact our system at sufficiently large scales. And so this is, if you look at this, we have, half of our study area basically experienced fire in some way. Um, Half of it didn't. And we also had decades of pre-fire data, and we continued to do surveys post-fire. So we had our before-after control impact natural experiment. And what we learned from this about the ecology of spotted owls in these burned landscapes is that in the most severely burned sites, spotted owl spotted owls basically went away. They became locally extinct following the fire, and that's shown in this vertical line. In contrast, um, the sites that burned a little bit, kind of around the edge of the fire, but didn't burn too much at high severity, so they experienced some high severity fire, but not more than half of the territory area. They actually continue to do quite well, and it's the last year of this data point is 2020, and it's 2025 now, and they actually are still doing quite well in those areas, similarly to the places that were unburned. And so this tells us quite a bit about how spotted owls interact with burn severity and extent. And so, in a place that experiences this patchy mosaic of places that burned at high severity, places that didn't burn at all, that's really what seems to support this population of spotted owls that we were studying. And so this was in California. We've replicated a similar study now in the southwestern US, which is where I'm located now in New Mexico. So this is some work that came out just last year in the journal Fire Ecology, looking again at how spotted owl site occupancy, or basically the presence or absence of owls, related to fire history. And what we found in this analysis is something similar, where if you look on the bottom panel here, the likelihood of a spotted owl site persisting over time, it decreased substantially when you had more high severity fire occur within that area. So again, more severe fire, not so good for owls. And at the same time, the chance of finding an owl in a given landscape, it increased if you had more frequent fires, which generally are associated with lower severity as well if you have frequent recurring fires in this system. And so this result we found in California, it kind of replicated here in the Southwest. And we've been thinking now about, this study and the previous one were kind of retrospective, and we've now done some work also thinking about how future fire risk might threaten this species. And so this is work by a former postdoc of mine, Josh Goldberg, who's now the statistician at the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service. And this work just came out recently. And basically what Josh was doing was mapping sort of the resistance and resilience of spotted owl habitat to future fire. And we were mapping that across watersheds in the Southwest. So the point here is just places that are red are likely to basically experience type conversion following severe fire, and are not likely to recover in the future. And so these are places where spotted owl habitat is particularly vulnerable, whereas the blue places are places that might be a little more resilient. are resistant to fire when it comes along, and they also may be able to recover following wildfire. So, just thinking not only about sort of past effects of fire, but thinking about future vulnerability and being able to identify places where we can think about managing and moving the needle on the resilience of some of the landscapes here. Like the red places are places we could focus on fuels reduction treatments, for example. So that's kind of the population view. But we've also zoomed way in and thought about how individual spotted owls interact with burned landscapes. Um, and this was work that I started during my PhD and has continued on. And what we have found in this case is that spotted owls, in the previous slides, I was talking about kind of how bad severe fire was for spotted owl populations. Well, it turns out when just a little bit of severe fire occurs within an owl territory, they tend to like it. And so on the left here, this is a surviving owl, an owl that survived the 2014 King Fire. And each one of the yellow plus signs is a location, a GPS location. And we found it foraging pretty heavily in this small, severe fire patch within its territory. Whereas this owl over here was pretty much completely avoiding this very large patch of severe fire, but using some of the smaller patches and some of the other areas that burned but didn't burn at high severity um, in this fire. And so again, like severe fire, we found is actually it's good for spotted owls when it occurs in small amounts, in amounts that are more consistent with that historical fire regime of this region, which is frequent and low severity fire in these low and mid elevation dry mixed conifer forests in California. Again, that was work in California. We've now replicated this again in New Mexico and Arizona. And so we've captured Mexican spotted owls, the Mexican subspecies, which is down here in New Mexico and Arizona and other parts of the Southwest. And we found similarly that GPS tagged spotted owls, they tend to sort of use these areas along the edge of previous fires. This thick cluster here is a nesting area, kind of in an unburned stand of forest. All along the edge of this fire, though, the owl was sort of foraging in the low and moderate and smaller patches or openings of high severity fire. And so just to put that into numbers, we found that owls were more likely, or this owl was more likely to use areas that had high pyrodiversity, sort of this mosaic of burned and unburned forest and of different severities. Whereas in general, they avoided uh, areas that had more high severity fire. So that's kind of this internal part of this high severity patch. So they would use high severity along the edges, but really not travel very far into it. And we actually went out and walked this territory after the field season was over and visited this little cluster of points. And this is kind of what that looks like, where you have a little refuge of green trees, maybe in this low severity yellow area, and the photo is taken from the high severity area. So this is an example of the kind of stuff that the owl will forage in, that has this mixture of different stand conditions. And I'm going to come back and talk more about that later. And so one of the questions we've had is why? Why do spotted owls tend to like these areas that are pyrodiverse, that have this mixture of different burn severities? What's the mechanism? And what we've started to do is look at what owls are eating and where they're capturing that food. And so we've been doing nest video camera studies that show the delivery of prey from adults that are hunting, particularly male spotted owls that are provisioning the nest, doing prey deliveries to their nestlings, and trying to understand the conditions that facilitate prey capture. And so some work by a former postdoc of mine, Kate McGinn, basically found that in pyrodiverse forests, I'll start this video over in the background, but in pyrodiverse forests, so forests that have this mosaic of burn severities, um, spotted owls are spending less energy, and energy is shown as sort of the fraction of this little flying squirrel that is shaded black. So they're spending less energy and getting more food in return when they forage in these kinds of pyrodiverse landscapes. Whereas, in contrast, in areas that have greater high severity fire, which is shown in gray and kind of red, is you have bigger blocks of that high severity fire and kind of less um, juxtaposition of the different burn severities. It's kind of more homogeneous. They spend more energy moving and they get less in return. So one of the mechanisms we think that's going on here is that it's actually an energetic benefit to spotted owls to be foraging in these kind of mosaic landscapes that have multiple resource types all next to each other. We've also been trying to understand how we've been using this Nest camera technology to try to understand how spotted owls might respond to forest management that's intended to alter burn severity. So, as many of you are probably familiar, we in a lot of these fire suppressed dry forests, we do fuels reduction, we do forest thinning, we remove trees and things like that to reduce tree density, mastication, etc., to try and create a more heterogeneous forest structure following a century of fire suppression. And we've been putting up Nest cameras to actually look at where spotted owls are capturing prey, what the conditions are at those places where they capture prey, and then we follow them back to the nest to see what it is they caught, and to watch them make those deliveries like I showed you in the previous video. So something we found in our study looking at spotted owl foraging in sort of unburned forests is that spotted owls are better at catching their preferred prey, the wood rat, in forests that have more heterogeneity in their age structure. And also, they're less good at capturing their preferred prey in forests that are dense. And so, put these two things together, and you see that spotted owls are just less successful at catching their preferred prey in places that are likely fire suppressed, that have a high density of mid-sized trees, and they're better at capturing prey in conditions that are associated with restored forests, so more heterogeneous age structure. And this gives us some clues into thinking about how fuels reduction treatment might affect owls, in that it might actually benefit them by increasing heterogeneity. That's where they end up capturing their preferred prey. Here's another cool example of this work we've done now in the Southwest, where we've captured owls and tracked their movements. And this is a neat example where we found this owl that's all these purple dots are from the same owl. And we found that they were spending a lot of time foraging down in this 10-year-old timber sale, which is really, it's kind of stark contrast with what we often associate spotted owls with. But they spent a lot of time foraging in this area, which again kind of had this open heterogeneous structure. And so the conditions associated with the treatment in this white area were really targeted at fuels reduction, which again just tells us that spotted owls are using these features that are associated with restored heterogeneous forests that probably optimize their energetic sort of balance and decision making. So another kind of piece we're trying to think about is how do we use movement information on spotted owls to inform fuels reduction in these fire-prone forests. And so basically what we're doing is we're looking at these protected areas for spotted owls that are called protected activity centers, and we're seeing how they use the space within protected activity centers to develop these heat maps of sort of use and avoidance by the owl. So purple areas would be areas that owls are using a lot, yellow areas not so much. And we can use this information to inform fuels reduction. So, hey, maybe we need to focus fuels reduction in these areas owls aren't using as much, whereas we want to avoid doing fuels reduction in the places they tend to be spending more time. And this is a huge step in the right direction towards um, reducing fuels in these protected areas that typically are some of the most flammable on the landscape because they have not had any management for so long. And then use this information to make kind of broader landscape predictions. All right. So that's kind of the first piece of the work that I do. And I hope that was kind of a new type of area for you to think about, is wildlife interactions with forests and fire. And the next piece is, how do multiple wildlife species kind of fit together in fire-prone landscapes and in post-fire landscapes? And so I come back to this picture I showed you earlier because I think it really does a nice job of showing what I call pyrodiversity, which is this mixture of different burn severities within a landscape, all juxtaposed together. This would be a landscape that I would say has high pyrodiversity. The fire effects are really variable spatially here, and they're patchy. And this kind of patchiness, it can provide a lot of different kinds of resources for different animals all in one place. And there's this idea in wildlife ecology and in biodiversity science in general that's called the pyrodivers biodiversity hypothesis. And it's the idea that areas with more pyrodiversity have more biodiversity, or more species that are present, because more niches are kind of available to the potential species that could inhabit that place. And so I won't spend too long on this, but these are kind of the different a visual depiction of some of the mechanisms that underlie this hypothesis. And so this one in orange, the habitat heterogeneity hypothesis, is really the one that I was talking about. A landscape with different burn severities, or different, stand ages regenerated by different fires, maybe provide habitat for different species. But you can also think about how biodiversity can support individual species by providing resource sort of complementarity. It can also provide refugia for predators or for prey that can support a stable predator-prey system. And there's other sort of changes in seasonality that could alter these hypotheses as well. But the point is that we think pyrodiversity can improve biodiversity. And so has some important conservation implications as well, but also just in terms of how we understand how these systems work and how species interact and assemble into communities in these fire-prone systems. I'm going to not spend too much time on this. This is from another talk where I was really talking about the methods, but myself and some colleagues have done work thinking about how we measure pyrodiversity. We've also done some work reviewing kind of how pyrodiversity can influence biodiversity at all sorts of spatial and temporal scales. So, pyrodiversity influencing just understory plant diversity at the 1 meter scale, all the way up to how it can create different niches for a whole community of bats at much, much larger scales. Same with over time. Pyrodiversity can promote sort of interactions between predators and prey in the span of days and months, all the way up to evolution of fire adaptive traits over the course of millions of years. And so the point here is that fire and wildlife and plants, fire and biodiversity in general, are so deeply linked that they influence how wildlife interact with each other and their behaviors at almost every spatial and temporal scale you can imagine. So there's just these really deep, inextricable links between fire and biodiversity. We've been doing some work here in the Southwest with some of my colleagues, Connor Wood and Jamie Sanderlin. Connor's at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Jamie Sanderlin's at the Rocky Mountain Research Station with me. And we've been using these acoustic monitors placed across a whole landscape to try and understand or measure this pyrodiversity biodiversity relationship. And so that's something we've been trying to get into. I will say, one of the downsides of studying fire is that you often have fires happen in the places that you're studying. And so this is just an example of some of our acoustic recording units that got burned. But what the point is, we can use these acoustic recording units to basically listen to what kinds of wildlife are present, particularly birds, and how they occur across these landscapes. And so we've down in the Black Range Ranger District of the Gila National Forest, we've distributed acoustic recording units across a whole bunch of sampling grids across different vegetation types. Across a burn severity gradient, and this is some work that's still ongoing right now. So I don't have results, but this is just one of the ways that we think about studying the relationship between fire and wildlife is looking across a gradient of, fire characteristics, maybe time sense fire, and seeing how wildlife and biodiversity respond. One really neat study that we completed just recently is a much larger scale acoustic monitoring study that looks at these wildlife species across the entire Sierra Nevada in California. So this is, as far as we know, the world's largest acoustic biodiversity monitoring program, and we've been looking at these different bird species and how they might respond to fire, and basically mapping their richness or their diversity across the whole Sierra Nevada, and looking at how different groups with different traits, maybe the birds that are more averse or affiliated with high severity fire, and how they might distribute themselves across the landscape and how they've responded to recent fires. And so this is again a much kind of larger landscape view, but thinking about how we see spatial variation, maybe hot spots or cold spots of diversity across different fire-prone landscapes and responses to wildfires. One really neat study that just recently was published was led by a postdoc that I'm advising who's at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. His name's Andrew Stillman. And Andrew is using eBird data, which is a global citizen science program to look at how different bird species are responding to fire across their entire geographic range. And so the idea here is that in different landscapes that this bird inhabits, it might be responding in different ways to different axes or aspects of fire because of local context or competition or other reasons. They might respond differently across space. So we're trying to understand sort of the range of responses that a given species might show across its entire geographic range. And so what this is showing here is for each of these species, sort of how each species is responding to different aspects of fire. So the top left here, just as an example, the American goshawk, showing that in some areas it responds negatively to time sense fire, which means that as we get further and further from the fire that occurred in time, so as fire gets further and further back in time, there's less and less goshawks. In contrast, there's other places where it's exactly the opposite. Goshawks are most abundant when it's been a long time since a fire. And so the point here is that we might see really big differences in how a single species responds to fire across its range. And we're still trying to figure out why this might be. And we also see that there's just variation in the strength of the relationships, even if it's all in the same direction for a whole host of other species. And so this has raised a lot more questions than it's answered for us, but it's been really rich to learn about sort of the diversity of how even a single species might respond to fire. Um, and then sort of as an extension of the work that I showed you that Josh Goldberg had done with spotted owls and future fire risk, um, a scientist in my lab, Carrie Norman, has now been using eBird data to map bird diversity across the whole Western US and different aspects of diversity, and then look at how those different aspects of bird diversity might be threatened by future fire. So this is showing areas where you have in the sort of the darker colors. are high biodiversity. So dark red, dark yellow is like high biodiversity value. And then red are places that are expected to burn at high severity in the future. And so basically, we can map out like those red areas, and this bottom map are areas of concern, places that have high biodiversity and that are likely to experience uncharacteristically severe fire. We can also look at areas that might have high biodiversity but are likely to not burn at high severity, and that's these blue areas or these refugia. So again, thinking big scale, how might all of this biodiversity fire relationships play out sort of at continental scales? And I'm going to skip this next one here. Okay, so the last kind of piece is thinking about um, landscape scale monitoring. How can we actually track what's happening in these really rapidly changing landscapes that we work in? And so monitoring species and habitats is kind of the last piece. This is what I call our living map project. And this is a project that's basically maps the distribution of species dynamically through time, looking at how fire and other types of interventions over disturbances change the distribution of habitat. So this is the Mexican spotted owl again, down in the Chiricahua Mountains in southeastern Arizona, just showing how much habitat has changed over time, and also sort of on this timeline down here showing when these fire events happen, you can see that habitat is reduced for the species. And so this is a tool that managers from the Forest Service have been really interested in using to try and sort of optimize where they're going in to do their treatment work and where the best remaining habitat is for planning purposes. And so this has allowed us to track changes in habitat across whole regions and across specific subregions. And it's also allowed us to look at potential causes of loss. So looking at annual changes in habitat and how much of that can be attributed to specific causes like wildfire. And then also how that may vary spatially. And I'm kind of skipping through this quickly because I want to get to a chance to have Q&A with everybody. We've also been we've done this work again, the sort of this living map approach for the California spotted owl recently, led by Ronan Hart, who's in my lab, looking at again sort of how habitat has changed over time. So that's what this map here is showing: is red is places that have lost habitat over time, blue is places that have gained in habitat. Here is that kingfire that I started out talking about way back in my first section, showing there's been habitat losses within the kingfire footprint. And also looking at how doing attribution of a whole range of causes. So how much of habitat loss over time can be attributed to severe fire, which is black, versus moderate severity fire, versus fuels management, kind of in pink, versus drought in orange. So really trying to understand how disturbances in general, fire specifically, but really more broad than that, fuels management and drought might be affecting habitat change. And we've been doing this now on a few different species of concern in the Southwest. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention is that we're what I just showed you is kind of tracking habitat of wildlife, but we also want to monitor the wildlife themselves, and their presence and absence in these changing landscapes. And so this is an example of that Sierra Nevada monitoring program, where we're using acoustic recording units to record wildlife species across the landscape and understand their changes. And I just want to end by saying, right now, Carrie Norman, who I mentioned earlier, is in the midst of developing this range-wide Mexican spotted owl range-wide acoustic monitoring program that could lead to the delisting of this species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. It's a humongous undertaking, but it's across 5 states and millions and millions and millions of hectares. And this is going to be work that will allow us into the future to track the presence and absence of owls and their density, and also of a whole host of other species inhabiting these landscapes. and track their responses to fire and forest management. So this is just some exciting work that's coming up. Okay, I'm going to wrap up and just give you a couple of take-home messages. Um, what I was hoping to communicate to you is that to really effectively conserve wildlife in the Pyrocene, we have to think about how ecology plays out across different scales. I talked about the individual, I talked about the populations, the communities, and then these whole landscapes. We have to understand how wildlife and fire interact across these different scales to get the full picture of not only the mechanisms that might be underlying these local changes and the broader threats that might be facing entire landscapes. And so that's really what my research focuses on, is trying to understand how fire affects wildlife across all those different scales. And then the second thing is just I hope that you guys maybe found yourselves a little excited about this, that, hey, there's cool career pathways that involve wildlife and fire and the intersection there. And I'll say, like, this is from a research perspective, this is an area that's really rapidly growing. And so there's a lot of researchers who are it's kind of a new field that's developing, that has developed in recent years. Um, and so I hope you consider looking into it and doing some work in this area, and maybe taking some courses or doing some internships or other things and starting to do studies in this area, because we need more people to do this kind of work. So I think I will leave it at that, and that is it.